I'm not guilty.
Ted Bundy was an American serial killer who, beginning in the 1970s and maybe earlier, abducted, raped, and killed several young women and girls. He finally admitted to 30 killings carried out in 7 states between 1974 and 1978 after more than a decade of denials. His actual victim count is unknown, but almost certainly far higher. Bundy was frequently praised for his charisma and good looks, qualities he used to gain the trust of his victims and society. Typically, he would approach his victims in public settings, pretending to have a physical impediment like an injury or to be an authority figure, before striking them until they were unconscious and transporting them to additional sites where they would be raped and strangled. Bundy frequently returned to his victims, grooming them and engaging in sexual activity with the bodies until rotting and destruction by wild animals prevented any further contact. At least 12 of his victims had their heads removed, and he stored the leaders in his apartment as souvenirs. He occasionally broke into people's homes at night and beat them as they slept. In 1975, Bundy was detained and imprisoned in Utah for attempted criminal assault and aggravated kidnapping. He then appeared as a suspect in a growing number of unsolved homicides in several states. Bundy, who was facing murder charges in Colorado, staged 2 spectacular escapes and carried out additional assaults, including 3 murders, in Florida before being finally apprehended in 1978. He was given 3 death sentences in 2 trials for the murders in Florida. On January 24, 1989, Bundy was put to death at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He was described as a cruel sociopath who took joy from another human's misery and the control he had over his victims, to the point of death and even after, according to biographer Ann Rule. In a past interview, Bundy called himself the cold-hearted son of a you'll ever meet, and lawyer Polly Nelson, a former member of his defense team, concurred. Ted was the epitome of uncaring wickedness, she claimed in her essay. Eleanor Louise Cowell, 1924-2012, better known by her middle name, gave birth to Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. Although a copy of his original birth certificate identified his father as unknown, it appears that salesperson and United States Air Force veteran Lloyd Marshall is his real father. His actual father's identity has never been established. Louise claimed to have met Jack Worthington, a war veteran, who allegedly abandoned her not long after she fell pregnant. According to census records, when Bundy was born, numerous males with the names John Worthington and Lloyd Marshall resided close to Louise. Some relatives harbored concerns that Louise's own father, Samuel Cowell, might have been Bundy's biological father. In the documentary Crazy, Not Insane, released in 2020, psychiatrist Dorothy Ottnow Lewis claimed to have obtained a sample of Ted Bundy's blood. However, she did not identify from where and to have organized a DNA test that determined Bundy was not the result of incest. Bundy's maternal grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, reared him as their son for the first 3 years of his life at their Philadelphia home. They did this to escape the social stigma associated with births outside of marriage at the time. Everyone, including young Ted, was informed that his mother was his older sister and his grandparents were his parents. Though his memories of the events were inconsistent, Bundy eventually learned the truth. He told a girlfriend that a cousin had shown him a copy of his birth certificate after calling him a bastard. Still, he claimed to biographers Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth that he had located the document alone. Bundy did not learn until 1969, when he discovered his genuine birth record in Vermont, according to author and biographer Ann Rule, who knew him closely. Bundy expressed a lifelong grudge against his mother for not disclosing his real father to him and for leaving him to determine his true parentage on his own. Early on, Bundy occasionally demonstrated strange behavior. Julia, Louise's younger sister, remembers waking up from a nap to discover herself encircled by kitchen knives and 3-year-old Ted grinning by the bed. Sandy Holt, Bundy's former next-door neighbor, called him a bully and stated, "He enjoyed frightening people. He enjoyed being in command. He enjoyed inflicting anguish, pain, and fear." In a few of his interviews, Bundy expressed his love for his grandparents and told Rule that he connected with, respected, and clung to his grandfather. However, he and other family members testified to attorneys in 1987 that Samuel was a tyrant bully who beat his wife and dog, displayed bigotry, including religious intolerance, racism, and xenophobia, and swung neighborhood cats by their tails. Samuel once tossed Julia down a flight of stairs for sleeping too much. At least once, when Bundy's paternity was questioned, he erupted into a violent rage and occasionally talked aloud to invisible entities. In Bundy's account, his grandmother was a shy and submissive person who occasionally received electroconvulsive therapy for depression and grew afraid to leave their home as she grew older. In more subsequent investigations, these descriptions of Bundy's grandparents have been called into question. Some residents described Samuel Cowell as a good man, despite being a little quirky. In 1950, Louise changed her last name from Cowell to Nelson and moved with Ted out of Philadelphia to live with her cousins Alan and Jane Scott in Tacoma, Washington, at the insistence of other family members. At an adult singles event held at Tacoma's First Methodist Church in 1951, she met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, 1921-2007, a hospital cook. Later that year, when they got married, Johnny legally adopted Ted. Johnny wasn't his true father. He wasn't very smart and didn't make much money, he later complained to a girlfriend. In later years, Bundy's memories of Tacoma changed. He told Michaud and Ainsworth about scouring his neighborhood for images of naked women and telling Polly Nelson about reading detective magazines, crime fiction, and true crime documentaries in search of stories about sexual violence, especially when the stories were illustrated with images of dead or hurt women. He claimed that he never, ever read fact detective periodicals and cringed at the concept that anyone would in a letter to Rule. He admitted to Michaud that he frequently drank much alcohol and spent late nights canvassing the town in search of open windows where he could watch women undress or anything else could be observed. It also varies how Bundy's social life is described. He claimed to be unable to comprehend interpersonal connections as a teenager, which is why he chose to be alone in interviews with Michaud and Ainsworth. He asserted that he lacked an innate understanding of how to form friendships. Bundy confessed, "I didn't know what made people want to be friends. I was unsure of what motivated social connections." Rule was informed by Bundy's Woodrow Wilson High School classmates that he was well known and well liked there, and that he was a medium-sized fish in a huge pond. Downhill skiing was Bundy's lone substantial athletic interest, which he followed with zeal while using stolen gear and fake lift tickets. He was detained at least twice during high school on suspicion of car theft and burglary. As is common in Washington and many other U.S. states, the specifics of the incidents were erased from his record after he turned 18 years old. Bundy attended the University of Puget Sound for 1 year following his high school graduation in 1965 before moving to the University of Washington to study Chinese. He started dating Diane Edwards, a classmate at the University of Washington in 1967, identified in Bundy's biographies by several pseudonyms, most commonly Stephanie Brooks. Bundy left college at the beginning of 1968 and took a number of minimum-wage jobs. While Arthur Fletcher was running for lieutenant governor of Washington state, he hired him as his driver and bodyguard. He also volunteered at Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign's Seattle office. As a Rockefeller delegate, Bundy attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami in August. Frustrated by Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition, Edwards abandoned their relationship soon after and left for her family's home in California. This crisis was, perhaps, the critical stage in his growth, according to psychiatrist Dorothy Ottnow-Lewis, who made this observation afterward. Devastated by the separation, Bundy made her way to Colorado before continuing her journey eastward, stopping in Philadelphia and Arkansas to see family while also enrolling for one semester at Temple University. Rule said Bundy visited the Burlington Birth Records office about this time in early 1969 and verified his real parentage. By the fall of 1969, Bundy had returned to Washington. Then he met Elizabeth Klopfer, an unmarried mother from Ogden, Utah, who worked as a secretary at the UW School of Medicine. Long after his initial detention in Utah in 1976, their turbulent connection would endure. Molly Klopfer was 3 years old when Bundy began dating her mother. He remained in her life until she was 10 years old after he had been incarcerated. Bundy then took on the role of a father figure for Molly. Beginning when she was 7 years old, Molly wrote about instances in which Bundy had been violent or inappropriately sexual with her as an adult. She claims that Bundy punched her in the face, knocked her to the ground, threatened to drown her, exposed her indecently, and touched her inappropriately while pretending it was an accident or a game. Bundy returned to the University of Washington in the middle of 1970, this time declaring psychology as her major. He graduated with honors and earned the respect of his lecturers. He accepted a position at the Suicide Hotline Crisis Center in Seattle in 1971. There, he met and collaborated with Ann Rule, a former Seattle police officer and aspiring crime writer who would later pen The Stranger Beside Me, one of the most important Bundy biographies. At the time, Rule didn't find anything unsettling about Bundy's character. She called him kind, solicitous, and empathetic. Bundy joined the re-election campaign of Governor Daniel J. Evans after receiving his degree from the University of Washington in 1972. He pretended to be a college student and followed former Governor Albert Rossellini, Evans' rival, while recording his campaign speeches for later study by Evans' team. Evans gave Bundy a position on the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. Bundy was appointed as Ross Davis's assistant after Evans won re-election as the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Bundy was praised by Davis, who characterized him as clever, aggressive, and a believer in the system. On the strength of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and a number of UW psychology professors, Bundy was admitted to the law schools of UPS and the University of Utah in early 1973 despite having subpar LSAT results. Bundy resumed his contact with Edwards during a trip to California in the summer of 1973 on behalf of the Republican Party. She was astounded at his development into a responsible and serious professional who appeared to be on the verge of a significant legal and political career. The two women were unaware of each other as Bundy continued dating Klopfer. He enrolled at UPS Law School in the fall of 1973 and pursued Edwards, who frequented Seattle to visit him. When they were talking about getting married, he introduced her to Davis as his fiancée. Bundy abruptly cut off all communication with Edwards in January 1974. Her calls and letters remained unanswered. After calling him for the first time after a month, she demanded to know why he had abruptly stopped their relationship without giving any reason. He answered, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean," in a flat, composed voice, and then hung up. He vanished from her life forever. Edwards concluded in hindsight that Bundy had purposefully planned the entire courting and rejection in advance as retaliation for the breakup she started in 1968. Bundy subsequently said, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her." At that point, Bundy had started missing law school classes. He stopped going by April when young girls started missing in the Pacific Northwest. No one can agree on the exact moment or location Bundy started murdering women. Even though he confessed in great detail to scores of later killings in the days leading up to his execution, he gave varied accounts of his crimes to different persons and would not reveal the facts of his early atrocities. He admitted to Nelson that he made his first attempt at an abduction in Ocean City, New Jersey, in 1969, but that he did not actually kill anyone until sometime later in Seattle. Despite declining to go into further detail, Bundy suggested to homicide investigator Robert D. Keppel that he had killed a hitchhiker near Tumwater in 1973 and a person in Seattle in 1972. According to Rule and Keppel, he may have begun killing while he was a teenager. When Bundy was 27 years old and committed his first known homicide in 1974. In the days before DNA profiling, he had, according to his own admission, perfected the skills required to leave only the barest amount of incriminating forensic evidence at crime sites. On January 4, 1974, just after midnight, Bundy entered the basement apartment of Karen Sparks, a dancer and University of Washington student who was 18 years old. He sexually abused Sparks after beating her with a metal rod or metal speculum from her bed frame, leaving her with severe internal wounds. Despite the fact that she survived and spent 10 days in the hospital unconscious, she was left with physical impairments. On February 1st, early in the morning, Bundy broke into Linda Ann Healy's basement room. Healy was a student at the University of Washington who broadcast the morning weather reports to skiers on the radio. He carried her away after beating her unconscious, dressing her in blue trousers, a white top, and boots. Female college students vanished during the first half of 1974 at a rate of roughly one per month. A 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, which is 95 kilometers, 60 miles, southwest of Seattle, Donna Gail Manson, left her dorm on March 12th to attend a jazz concert there, but has yet to show up. On April 17th, Susan Elaine Rancourt, who was attending nighttime advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, vanished while she was making her way to her dorm room. Later, two female Central Washington students came forward to describe encounters with a man wearing a sling who was requesting assistance carrying a load of books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. One of these encounters occurred the night of Rancourt's disappearance, and the other occurred 3 nights earlier. Roberta Kathleen Parks left her Oregon State University dorm in Corvallis, which is 260 miles south of Seattle, on May 6th to meet friends for coffee at the Memorial Union, but she is yet to show up. Seattle and King County investigators became more worried. The missing women shared little in common with one another outside their comparable appearance as young, pretty white college students with long hair parted in the middle. There was also little in the way of physical evidence. Brenda Carol Ball, 22, vanished on June 1st while she was leaving Berrien's Flame Tavern, which is close to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She was last observed conversing with a brown-haired male with his arm in a sling in the parking lot. Jorgan Hawkins, a University of Washington student, went missing early on June 11th while crossing the street from her sorority home to her boyfriend's dorm. 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminalist searched the entire alleyway on their hands and knees the following morning without discovering anything. Later, Bundy admitted to Keppel that he had lured Hawkins to his car and used a crowbar to strike her senselessly. He handcuffed her and drove her to Issaquah, a neighborhood east of Seattle, where he strangled her and spent the night with her corpse. Issaquah is 20 miles from Seattle. The following morning, he went back to the UW Alley and, in the midst of a significant crime scene investigation, found and took Hawkins's earrings and one of her shoes from the nearby parking lot, where he had placed them and then left unnoticed. According to Keppel, it was a daring feat that still astounds police today. Bundy claimed to have visited Hawkins's body 3 times. After Hawkins's disappearance was made public, witnesses said they saw a man in an alleyway behind a nearby dorm the night she vanished. He attempted carrying a briefcase using crutches and a leg cast. According to one woman, the man asked her to assist him in carrying the case to his light brown Volkswagen Beetle. Bundy authored a booklet for women on rape prevention while he was employed at the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission as the assistant director in Olympia during this time. Later, he was employed by the Department of Emergency Services, DES, a state government body charged with investigating the disappearance of the ladies. News of the heinous assault on Sparks and the 6 missing women was widely reported in newspapers and on television throughout Oregon and Washington. Law enforcement authorities came under increasing pressure, but they needed more tangible proof to be able to support them. Police refused to give the media the scant information they had because they thought it may jeopardize their investigation. Additional commonalities amongst the victims included the fact that they always vanished at night, frequently close to active construction sites, and within a week of a midterm or final exam. All of the victims were last seen wearing slacks or blue jeans, and numerous crime locations featured sightings of a man driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle while carrying a cast or sling. The killings in Oregon and Washington came to a head on July 14th when 2 women were kidnapped in broad daylight from a busy beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah. A young man with an appealing appearance who had his left arm in a sling and was speaking with a light accent, possibly Canadian or British, was seen by 5 female witnesses. He identified himself as Ted and asked for assistance in getting a sailboat out of his tan or bronze Volkswagen Beetle. 4 refused, and 1 followed him all the way to his car before realizing there was no sailboat and taking off. 3 more witnesses saw him approach Janice Ann Ott, 23, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court, and witnessed her leave the beach in his company. He told her the sailboat narrative. Denise Marie Naslund, a 19-year-old studying to be a computer programmer, left a picnic 4 hours later to use the restroom and never came back. Bundy admitted to William Hagmeyer and Stephen Michaud that Ott was alive when he returned with Naslund, and that he had made the other witness the killing of the other under duress. Still, he later denied it in an interview with Lewis on the day before his execution. Once King County Police had a complete description of their suspect and his vehicle, they distributed flyers around the Seattle region. Regional newspapers and local television stations both ran a composite sketch. The profile, the sketch, and the car were all recognized by Klupfer Rule, a DES employee, who suggested Bundy as a potential suspect. However, detectives, who were receiving up to 200 tips per day, thought it unlikely that a well-groomed law student with no adult criminal record could be the perpetrator. The skeleton remains of Ott and Naslund were discovered on September 6 by 2 grouse hunters close to a service road in Issaquah, 2 miles east of Lake Sammamish State Park. Later, Bundy determined that the extra femur and many vertebrae at the scene were really Hawkins. On Taylor Mountain, where Bundy frequently walked, just east of Issaquah, forestry students from Green River Community College found the skulls and mandibles of Healy, Rancourt, Parks, and Ball 6 months later. The remains of Manson were never found. Bundy left Klupfer in Seattle after receiving a second admittance to the University of Utah Law School in August 1974. He dated at least a dozen other women while still calling Klupfer frequently. He was dismayed to learn that the other students had something, some intellectual aptitude, that he did not, as he reread the first-year law curriculum. The lectures were utterly beyond his comprehension. It was a massive letdown for him, he admitted. The following month saw the start of a fresh wave of killings, including 2 that wouldn't be revealed until Bundy admitted to them just before his death. He assaulted and strangled an unnamed hitchhiker in Idaho on September 2nd and either dumped the body right away in a river or came back the next day to take pictures and dismember it. He kidnapped Nancy Wilcox, 16, on October 2nd in Holiday, Utah, a Salt Lake City enclave. Approximately 200 miles south of Holiday, Bundy told investigators that her remains were buried close to Capitol Reef National Park, but were never discovered. The 17-year-old daughter of the Mid-Vale, a different neighborhood of Salt Lake City, Police Chief Melissa Ann Smith, vanished on October 18th after leaving a pizzeria. 9 days after she vanished, her naked body was discovered in a neighboring mountainous area. A post-mortem test revealed that she may have survived for up to 7 days after that. In Leahy, 25 miles south of there, on October 31st, Laura Ann Aim, also 17, vanished after leaving a cafe just after midnight. On Thanksgiving Day, hikers 9 miles to the northeast discovered her naked body in American Fork Canyon. Both girls had suffered from beatings, rapes, sodomizations, and nylon stocking strangulations. Years later, Bundy spoke of the post-mortem procedures he performed on the bodies of Smith and Amy, including shampooing their hair and applying cosmetics. In the late afternoon of November 8th, less than a mile from the Mid-Vale restaurant where Smith was last seen, Bundy got in touch with 18-year-old phone operator Carol Durant at Fashion Place Mall in Murray. Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department introduced himself and informed Durant that someone had attempted to break into her car. He requested her to go with him to complain at the station. Bundy quickly pulled over onto the shoulder and attempted to handcuff her after Durant pointed out that he was traveling on a road that didn't lead to the police station. During their struggle, he unintentionally secured both handcuffs on the same wrist in Durant to unlock the car door and flee. Deborah Jean Kent, a 17-year-old student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, which is located 20 miles north of Murray, vanished later that evening after leaving the school's theater show to pick up her brother. Police were informed by the theater instructor at the school and a student that a stranger had requested them all to come out to the parking lot to identify an automobile. The same man was later noticed pacing at the back of the auditorium by a different student, and the drama teacher eventually caught him again just before the play ended. Investigators discovered a key outside the theater that allowed them to release Durant from his restraints. In November, Klopfer made a second call to King County Police after learning that young women were going missing in areas around Salt Lake City. She was Major Crimes Section Detective Randy Hergesheimer thoroughly questioned her. Although Bundy's name was added to their list of suspects, there was no reliable forensic evidence connecting him to the crimes in Utah at the time. After finishing his final examinations, Bundy traveled back to Seattle in January 1975, where he spent a week with Klopfer, who kept a secret from him that she had reported him to the police 3 times. Bundy moved a large portion of his criminal enterprise from his Utah headquarters to Colorado in 1975. On January 12th, Karen Eileen Campbell, a 23-year-old registered nurse, vanished as she made her way down a well-lit hallway from the elevator to her room at the Wildwood Inn, now the Wildwood Lodge, in Snowmass Village, which is located 640 kilometers southeast of Salt Lake City. A month later, her naked body was discovered near a dirt road far from the resort. Her body also showed significant cuts from a sharp weapon. Blows had slain her to the head from a blunt instrument that left recognizable linear groove depressions on her skull. Julie Cunningham, a 26-year-old ski instructor from Vail, vanished on March 15th while traveling from her apartment to a dinner meeting with a friend. around 100 miles northeast of Snowmass. Later, Bundy admitted to Colorado police that he had approached Cunningham on crutches and asked her to assist him in carrying his ski boots to his car. He then beat and handcuffed Cunningham before sexually assaulting and strangling her at a second location close to Rifle, 140 kilometers west of Vail. He traveled from Salt Lake City to see her remains 6 hours after a few weeks passed. On April 6th, while cycling to her parents' house in Grand Junction, Colorado, Denise Lynn Oliverson, 25, vanished. Her bicycle and sandals were later discovered beneath a viaduct close to a railroad overpass. Lynette Dawn Culver, 12, was enticed by Bundy on May 6 from Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, which is about 160 miles north of Salt Lake City. He murdered her by drowning her in his hotel room before dumping her remains in a river, perhaps the Snake River, north of Pocatello. 3 of Bundy's co-workers from the Washington State DES, including Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City in mid-May and stayed in his apartment for a week. He then spent a week in Seattle with Klopfer at the beginning of June, when they talked about being married the Christmas after that. Again, Klopfer should have mentioned her several conversations with Salt Lake County and King County officials. Neither Bundy's prolonged connection with Boone nor his contemporaneous involvement with a Utah law student described variously as Kim Andrews or Sharon Auer were publicized. Susan Curtis disappeared on June 28 from the Brigham Young University campus in Provo, which is located 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. Bundy's final confession, which was taped just before he entered the execution chamber, contained details of her murder. Finding the remains of Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Oliverson, Culver, and Curtis was never possible. Once he was found guilty of kidnapping in 1976, the LDS Church excommunicated him. When questioned about his preferred religion following his incarceration, Bundy replied, Methodist, citing his upbringing. Investigations into the murder spree in the Pacific Northwest that stopped as abruptly as it had begun were still ongoing in Washington state. They turned to the then innovative tactic of creating a database in an effort to make sense of an overwhelming amount of data. As the only one accessible, they employed the King County payroll computer, a big primitive machine by modern standards. They searched the computer for coincidences after entering the several lists they had assembled, including classmates and associates of each victim, Volkswagen owners named Ted, known sex offenders, and more. Out of thousands of names, 26 appeared on 4 lists, with Ted Bundy being one of them. Officer Bob Hayward of the Utah Highway Patrol detained Bundy on August 16, 1975, in Granger, another suburb of Salt Lake City. Hayward saw Bundy driving through a neighborhood in his Volkswagen Beetle in the early morning hours before spotting the patrol cruiser. Hayward looked around the Volkswagen and saw that the front passenger seat had been removed and put on the back seats. He discovered other items that, at first glance, appeared to be burglary tools, including a ski mask, a second mask made out of pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, and an ice pick. According to Bundy, he had discovered the handcuffs in a dumpster, and the other items were standard home stuff. The ski mask was for skiing. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered Bundy's name from Klopfer's phone call a month later, and a similar suspect and automobile description from the November 1974 Durant kidnapping. Police discovered a flyer for the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, where Kent vanished, and a map to Colorado ski resorts with a checkmark beside the Wildwood Inn when searching Bundy's apartment. Bundy was released on his own recognizance because the police lacked sufficient evidence to hold him. Later, Bundy claimed that a concealed cache of Polaroid pictures of his victims, which he later destroyed after being freed, had eluded the searches. The Salt Lake City police put Bundy under constant observation, and Thompson and two other detectives took a flight to Seattle to speak with Klopfer. She claimed that in the year before Bundy moved to Utah, she had found items in both Bundy's apartment and her home that she couldn't explain. Crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris that he admitted stealing from a pharmacy, and a meat cleaver that was never used for cutting meat were among these things. A bag full of women's clothing, a pair of surgical gloves, and an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove box were other items. Since Bundy was always in debt, Klopfer believed that practically everything of value that Bundy owned had been stolen. When she challenged him about a new TV and stereo, he threatened to break her neck if she told anyone. She claimed Bundy grew extremely agitated if she even considered cutting her long, middle-parted hair. Sometimes, when she woke up in the middle of the night, he looked at her body with a flashlight under the blankets. He frequently took her Volkswagen Beetle, which he kept in the trunk for safety, and taped a lug wrench halfway up the handle. The investigators determined that neither the day Ott and Naslund were kidnapped from Lake Sammamish State Park, nor any of the evenings that the victims from the Pacific Northwest had gone missing, Bundy had not been there with Klopfer. When Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney spoke with Klopfer shortly after, she discovered Diane Edwards' existence and her brief engagement to Bundy around Christmas 1973. Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a Midvale kid in September. Utah police seized it and FBI specialists disassembled and searched it. Hairs were discovered that matched those taken from Campbell's body. Later, they discovered hair fragments that were microscopically indistinguishable from Smith's and Duranche's. According to FBI lab specialist Robert Neal, finding hair strands matching three distinct victims who had never met one another in a single car would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. On October 2nd, investigators lined up Bundy. Witnesses from Bountiful identified him as the foreigner in the Viewmont High School auditorium, and Duranche recognized him immediately as Officer Roseland. In the Duranche case, there was more than enough evidence to accuse him of aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault, but not enough to connect him to Kent, whose body was never discovered. He was granted freedom on a $15,000 bail, which his parents covered. He resided in Klopfer's home in Seattle most of the time between his arrest and trial. Police in Seattle kept him under close observation despite not having enough evidence to charge him with the deaths that occurred in the Pacific Northwest. According to Klopfer, so many unmarked police cars began coming up that it sounded like the start of the Indy 500 when Ted and I stepped out onto the porch to go somewhere. In November, 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states convened in Aspen, Colorado, where the 3 main Bundy investigators, Jerry Thompson from Utah, Robert Keppel from Washington, and Michael Fisher from Colorado, exchanged information. Officials concluded that more concrete evidence would be required before Bundy could be prosecuted for any of the murders, even though they left the meeting, later known as the Aspen Summit, sure that he was the murderer they were looking for. Bundy was put on trial for the kidnapping of Duranche in February 1976. He forfeited his right to a jury on the recommendation of his lawyer, John O'Connell, because of the controversy surrounding the case. He was convicted guilty of kidnapping and assault by Judge Stuart Hanson, Jr. following a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation. In June, he was given a prison term of 1 to 15 years at Utah State Prison. He was placed in solitary confinement for many weeks after being discovered hidden in the bushes in the prison yard carrying an escape package that included a Social Security card, road atlases, and airline itineraries. Colorado authorities accused him of killing Campbell later that month. He first resisted extradition, but in January 1977 he waived the process and was sent to Aspen. For a preliminary hearing, Bundy was driven 40 miles on June 7, 1977, from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen. The judge released him from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles since he had chosen to act as his own attorney. He requested to use the courthouse's law library during a break to conduct research for his case. He opened a window and fell to the earth from the second story while hiding behind a bookcase from his guard's eyes, breaking his right ankle on impact. Bundy discarded his outer layer of clothing and limped through the town as barricades were set up on Aspen's outskirts. He then went southward to Aspen Mountain. He broke into a hunting cabin close to the peak and took food, clothes, and a rifle. He left the chalet the next day and headed south toward Crested Butte, but became lost in the forest. He missed two routes that headed down the mountain to his targeted location during his 2 days of aimless wandering. On June 10th, he broke into a camper trailer on Maroon Lake, which is 10 miles south of Aspen. He stole food and a ski parka, but instead of going south, he turned around and went back toward Aspen while dodging search teams and obstacles. He stole a car at the Aspen Golf Course's edge 3 days later. Bundy returned to Aspen while suffering from the cold, lack of sleep, and persistent discomfort from his sprained ankle. 2 policemen stopped him after noticing his car swerving in and out of their lanes. He'd been on the run for 6 days. Maps of the mountains near Aspen that the prosecution was using to show where Campbell's body was found were in the car, showing that Bundy's escape had been planned. As his own attorney, he was entitled to discovery rights. Bundy disregarded the counsel of friends and attorneys to remain in place and returned to Glenwood Springs Jail. The prosecution's case, which was already at best tenuous, was progressively losing strength as essential pieces of evidence were routinely ruled inadmissible, and pre-trial motions were consistently decided in his favor. A more sensible defendant could have understood that his chances of being found not guilty were good, and that successfully defending against the murder accusation in Colorado would likely have discouraged other prosecutors. If Ted had persisted, he might have been released from his Duranch conviction with as little as a year and a half remaining. Bundy instead put together a fresh escape strategy. He obtained a hacksaw blade and a full Garfield County jail floor plan from other prisoners. He also gathered $500 in cash, which guests, including Boone, brought in illegally over a 6-month period. He sawed a hole in the ceiling of his cell that measured about 1 square foot, 0.093 square meters, between the steel reinforcing bars while other prisoners had showers at night. He could crawl through and investigate the crawl space above after losing 35 pounds, which enabled him to perform several practices in the following weeks. Claims of movement in the ceiling made by an informant during the night should have been looked into. By the end of 1977, Bundy's upcoming trial had gained national attention in the sleepy hamlet of Aspen, and he moved for the trial to be held in Denver. The motion was granted on December 23rd by the Aspen trial judge, but Colorado Springs was chosen because its jurors had a reputation for being unfriendly to murder suspects. On the evening of December 30th, with the majority of the jail staff away for the holiday and nonviolent inmates enjoying time off with their families, Bundy made his bed out of books and folders, covered it with a blanket to resemble his sleeping body, and crept into the crawl space. He entered the main jailer's apartment via the roof when the latter was out for the evening with his wife, changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet, and then escaped through the front door. After taking a car, Bundy left Glenwood Springs heading east, but the vehicle soon broke down on Interstate 70 in the Rockies. A passing driver gave him a ride into Vail, 60 miles to the east. He took a bus from there to Denver, where he booked an early morning flight to Chicago. The jail's skeleton staff in Glenwood Springs did not learn about the escape until midday on December 31st, more than 17 hours later. Bundy was already in Chicago at that point. Bundy took a train from Chicago to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he was present on January 2nd in a neighborhood bar. He stole a car and traveled to Atlanta, Georgia, 5 days later. From there, he took a bus and landed in Tallahassee, Florida, early on January 8th. He spent one night in a hotel before renting a room at a boarding house close to the Florida State University campus using Chris Hagen's identity. Later, Bundy claimed that his initial intent was to find gainful employment and stop engaging in criminal activity because he believed he could continue to live freely and unnoticed in Florida for as long as he avoided drawing the attention of the police. However, his one and only job application at a construction site had to be abandoned when he was required to show identification. He resumed his previous behaviors of shoplifting and robbing cash and credit cards from women's wallets left in abandoned shopping carts at neighborhood supermarkets. 1 week after arriving in Tallahassee, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority home at Florida State University through the back door with a broken locking mechanism on January 15, 1978. He hit Margaret Bowman, 21, with a hefty piece of oak firewood beginning at around 2:45 a.m., shattering her skull. Then, after ripping her panties off violently enough to cause friction burns on one of her thighs, he garroted her with a nylon stocking. After killing Bowman, he crossed the hall and went straight into the bedroom of Lisa Levy, 20, where he beat her until she was unconscious and strangled her. Bundy bit into Levy's left buttock and through one of her nipples, almost severing it from her right breast, in what would later be considered one of the most important pieces of evidence against him at his trial. He raped her vaginally and anally in a brutal attack that tore her internal organs, using a bottle of hair mist that Levy had in her room. He attacked Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler in an adjacent bedroom, fracturing Kathy Kleiner's jaw and severely lacerating her shoulder. Karen Chandler also sustained a concussion, a broken jaw, tooth loss, and a crushed finger. Kleiner claimed that Chandler and Kleiner escaped the attack because car headlights illuminated the inside of their room and scared the assailant away. Nita Neary, a sorority sister, entered via the back door as Bundy fled the scene and caught him in the act. Detectives in Tallahassee discovered that the 4 assaults occurred in a span of fewer than 15 minutes, in close proximity to more than 30 witnesses who were oblivious to anything. Shortly after Bundy's outburst, police gathered at the sorority house and started looking into the situation. Initially, people mistook Levy's bite mark for a gunshot wound. Levy initially survived the attack despite being critically hurt and unconscious, however. She passed away shortly after while being transported to the hospital. Bundy traveled to a duplex 8 blocks away within the hour, put on a handmade pantyhose mask with holes cut out for him to look through, and then approached the apartment's basement window and went through it while it was dark. Around 4 a.m., Bundy saw FSU student Cheryl Thomas asleep in her bed and attacked her savagely, dislocating her shoulder and breaking her jaw and skull 5 times. For some reason, Bundy took off his mask and threw it on the mattress. Thomas's neighbors in the nearby rooms heard the commotion and called the police, who arrived to find her lying in bed, severely battered. The authorities discovered a semen stain on the bed in addition to the mask he had left behind, which included hairs similar to Bundy's in class and characteristic. However, there was no proof of a sexual assault. Law enforcement was baffled by the timing of Bundy's attack on Thomas, with Sheriff Ken Katsaris expressing shock and skepticism that the same person would strike again in such a short time. On February 8th, Bundy took a stolen FSU van 150 miles east to Jacksonville. Leslie Parmenter, 14, the daughter of the Jacksonville Police Department's chief of detectives, was in a parking lot when he approached her. He introduced himself as Richard Burton, Fire Department, but withdrew when Parmenter's older brother confronted him. He turned around and headed back to Lake City, 60 miles to the west. The next day at Lake City Junior High School, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was asked by a teacher to go to her homeroom to get a lost pocketbook. She never returned to class. Her partially mummified bones were discovered 7 weeks later, following a thorough search, in a pig farrowing shed close to Suwannee River State Park, 35 miles northwest of Lake City. Theoretically, Leach had been raped with a knife before having her neck slashed, according to forensic specialists. On February 12th, Bundy stole a car and left Tallahassee, traveling through the Florida Panhandle as he ran out of money to pay his past due rent and grew increasingly concerned that the authorities were pursuing him. He was apprehended by Pensacola police officer David Lee 3 days later at around 1 a.m. after a wants and warrants check revealed his Volkswagen Beetle had been stolen. Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from under him and fled after learning he was being arrested. Lee chased after him and tackled him after firing 2 warning bullets. Before the officer managed to overpower and arrest Bundy, the two engaged in a battle for Lee's gun. 3 sets of female FSU student IDs, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen television were all found in the stolen car. The disguise used by Richard Burton Fire Department in Jacksonville was later determined to be a pair of plaid slacks and a pair of dark-rimmed non-prescription glasses that were also discovered. Unaware that he had just apprehended one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, Lee was transporting his suspect to jail when he overheard Bundy saying, "I wish you had murdered me." In June 1979, Bundy was put on trial for the Chi Omega murders and assaults after the trial's location was changed to Miami. The trial was the first to be broadcast nationwide on American television and was covered by 250 reporters from 5 different countries. Although 5 court-appointed counsels were present, Bundy handled most of his defense once more. He sabotaged the entire defense effort from the beginning out of spite, distrust, and grandiose delusion, Nelson later remarked. Ted was accused of murder and could receive the death penalty, but all that mattered to him, it seemed, was being in command. A pre-trial plea agreement was reached, according to Mike Minerva, a Tallahassee public defender and defense team member, in which Bundy would admit to killing Levy, Bowman, and Leach in exchange for a set sentence of 75 years in prison. According to one report, prosecutors were open to a compromise since they had a very strong chance of losing at trial. Bundy, on the other hand, considered the plea agreement as a tactical maneuver that would allow him to submit his plea and then wait a few years for witnesses to pass away, move on, or recant their testimony, as well as for evidence to break down or go missing. He may pursue a post-conviction request to throw aside the plea and get an acquittal once the prosecution's case against him has deteriorated beyond repair. But at the last minute, Bundy rejected the offer. He realized that he would have to confess his crime in front of everyone, Minerva added. He just wasn't able to accomplish it. Chi Omega sorority members Connie Hastings, who located Bundy in the area of the sorority house that evening, and Nita Neary, who saw him leave home holding the murder weapon, both provided significant testimony during the trial. The impressions of the bite mark Bundy left on Levy's left buttock, which forensic odontologist Richard Souveron and Lowell Levine matched to castings of Bundy's teeth, were among the physically incriminating items of evidence. On July 24, 1979, the jury found Bundy guilty of the murders of Bowman and Levy, 3 charges of attempted first-degree murder for the assaults on Kleiner, Chandler, and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary after deliberating for less than 7 hours. For the murder convictions, trial judge Edward Cowart handed death sentences. A second trial for Leach's kidnapping and murder was held in Orlando 6 months later. After less than 8 hours of deliberation, Bundy was found guilty once more, primarily because of the evidence of an eyewitness who observed him escorting Leach to his stolen van from the schoolyard. Clothing fibers with a unique manufacturing flaw were discovered in the van and on Leach's body. These fibers matched those from Bundy's jacket when he was apprehended. Bundy took advantage of an obscure Florida rule that said that a marriage statement made in court in the presence of a judge constituted a valid marriage during the punishment phase of the Leach trial. He proposed to her as he was questioning Boone, who had relocated to Florida to be close to Bundy, had testified in support of him during both trials, and was now testifying as a character witness. She agreed, and Bundy informed the judge that their marriage was valid. On February 10, 1980, Bundy received a third electrocution death sentence. He reportedly stood when the verdict was read and said, "Tell the jury they were incorrect."
They were wrong.
It would be almost 9 years after this third death sentence was actually executed. Boone gave birth to Rose in October 1981 and identified Bundy as the father. While conjugal visits were prohibited at the Florida State Prison at Rayford, where Ted Bundy was held, it was common knowledge for prisoners to band together and pay the guards to grant them private time with their female guests. Bundy began a series of interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth soon after the Leach trial ended and the protracted appeals process got underway. He started disclosing information about his crimes and mental processes for the first time, primarily speaking in the third person to avoid the stigma of confession.
Hawkins' girl's head was severed and taken up the road about 25 to 50 yards and buried in a location about 10 yards west of the road on a rocky hillside.
When Bundy described his career as a thief, Klopfer's long-held hunch that he had stolen almost everything of value from him was confirmed. "The biggest reward for me," he continued, "was really having what I had taken. I thoroughly loved possessing something that I had sought out and gotten." Possession was a significant factor in both rape and murder cases. He claimed that sexual assault satisfied his desire to completely possess his victims. He initially murdered his victims as a matter of convenience to eliminate the prospect of being caught. However, later on, murder became a part of the adventure. He claimed that taking a life was the ultimate possession. The actual possession of the remains follows. Bundy also shared information with FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit Special Agent William Hagmaier. Hagmaier was astounded by Bundy's deep, even supernatural delight from killing. Hagmaier recalled, he explained that after a while, murder is not only a crime of lust or violence, it takes possession of it. The places where you kill them or leave them to become precious to you, and you will always be pulled back to them. They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you. You two are forever one. Bundy informed Hagmaier that he initially saw himself as an impulsive and amateur killer before transitioning into what he called his prime or predator phase around the time of Healy's murder in 1974. Despite the fact that he never officially acknowledged killing, this meant that he started doing it well before 1974. 2 hacksaw blades were concealed in Bundy's cell when prison authorities searched it in July 1984. One of the cell's windows had a steel bar that had been entirely sawed through at the top and bottom and put back in with homemade soap-based glue. When guards discovered an illicit mirror a few months later, Bundy was sent to a new cell. Shortly after, he was accused of a disciplinary offense for having unapproved correspondence with John Hinckley, Jr., a notorious felon. With an attempt to aid in the continuing search in Washington for the Green River Killer, subsequently identified as Gary Ridgway, Bundy got in touch with Keppel in October 1984 and offered to impart his alleged knowledge of serial killer psychology. Bundy was interviewed by Keppel and Green River Task Force detective Dave Reichert, but Ridgway evaded capture for an additional 17 years. After working with Michaud on another analysis of the interview materials, Keppel produced a thorough description of the Green River interviews. The Chi Omega convictions were scheduled for death on March 4, 1986. The U.S. Supreme Court provided a brief stay, but the execution was swiftly rescheduled. The full extent of Bundy's crimes, including what he did to some of his victims after they died, were ultimately revealed to Hagmaier and Nelson in April, just after the new date, July 2nd, was announced. He said that he frequently returned to the secondary murder scenes of Taylor Mountain, Issaquah, and other locations to lie with his victims and engage in sexual activities with their bodies before putrefaction forced him to stop. In some instances, he spent the entire night while driving several hours each way. In Utah, he constantly washed Ames' hair and put cosmetics on Smith's dead face. He told Hagmaier, "If you've got time, they can be anything you want them to be." He used a hacksaw to cut off the skulls of perhaps 12 of his victims and at least one group of the severed heads, likely the 4 later discovered on Taylor Mountain, Rancourt, Parks, Ball, and Healy, was kept in his apartment before being disposed of. Less than 15 hours before the scheduled July 2nd execution, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed it indefinitely. It remanded the Chi Omega case for review on a number of technicalities, including Bundy's capacity to stand trial and a mistaken instruction by the trial judge during the penalty phase requiring the jury to decide between life in prison and the death penalty, that in the end were never resolved. The Leach sentence was then scheduled to be executed on November 18th. On November 17th, the 11th Circuit Court issued a stay. Despite the dissents of Justices Thurgood Marshall and William J. Brennan, Jr., the Supreme Court declined to revisit the 11th Circuit's decision against Bundy in December 1988. After that last refusal, a firm execution date of January 24, 1989, was declared shortly after. For a case involving capital murder, Bundy's progress through the appellate courts had been extraordinarily quick. Contrary to common assumption, Bundy was hurried through the legal system as quickly as possible. Even the prosecutors admitted that Bundy's attorneys never used delay strategies. Even though Ted Bundy's execution appeared to be taking longer than expected, Ted Bundy was actually close to being executed. After exhausting all appeals, Bundy decided to be open and honest with the authorities because he had no reason to continue to try to cover up his crimes. He admitted to Keppel that he was responsible for all 8 of the murders in Oregon and Washington, for which he was the main suspect. He described 2 more fatalities in Oregon and 2 more in Washington who were previously unknown, if indeed he ever knew their identities. He claimed that Manson's body was the 6th, but her head was burned in Klopfer's fireplace. Keppel remarked, "He detailed the Issaquah murder scene, and it was almost as if he had just been there. Ott, Naslund, and Hawkins's bones were discovered there, as if he could see everything. He spent so much time there that he was enamored with the idea. Simply said, he is always completely preoccupied with murder." Nelson had similar thoughts. The blatant misogyny of his actions as well as his obvious rage against women astounded her, she noted. He had no empathy at all since he was so preoccupied with the facts. His life's work consisted of killings. Bundy admitted to committing multiple further homicides, including several that the police were unaware of, to detectives from Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. He explained that he could bring his victims back to his apartment in Utah so that he could reenact scenes from detective magazine covers. It didn't take long for a new ulterior plan to become clear. By withholding key information, he hoped to secure yet another stay of execution. He acknowledged, "There are more buried bones in Colorado," but he made no further comment. The new plan, which was quickly called Ted's Bones for Time plot, did little to provide fresh specific information and instead strengthened the authorities' desire to see Bundy killed on schedule. When he provided specifics, nothing was discovered. Bundy's supporters started pushing for the only available option, executive clemency, after it became evident that the courts would grant no additional stays. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Bundy was put to death in the Rayford electric chair. His final words were, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to offer my love to my family and friends," spoken to his lawyer Jim Coleman and Methodist pastor Fred Lawrence. Hundreds of people celebrated as the white hearse carrying Bundy's body left the prison as they sang, danced, and lit fireworks in a pasture across from the prison as the execution was carried out. In accordance with his wishes, he was cremated in Gainesville, and his ashes were dispersed at an undisclosed place in the Cascade Range of Washington state. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer. In the 1970s, he kidnapped, raped, and murdered 33 young men, 5 of whom remain unidentified. The case of this murderer became a turning point for American society. The image of a public figure, a party member who worked part-time at children's parties, concealed sadistic tendencies. The press dubbed him the Killer Clown. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy committed 33 confirmed murders. He buried the bodies of 26 victims in the crawl space of his home and disposed of 4 others in a river. After his arrest, Gacy claimed that around 150 boys and young men had visited his home, most of whom he lured into sexual encounters for monetary rewards. Sometimes he would simply engage them in conversation, offer life advice, and treat them to food and drinks, after which he either let them go or proposed sexual activities. According to Gacy's own testimony, his victims included those who argued with him over payment for sexual services and those who refused sex, whom he believed might report him to the police for sexual harassment. Gacy lured his victims into his home through various means, offering them work in his company or providing alcohol or drugs. Armed with a fake police badge, he would sometimes place his victims in his car and later take them to his house, simulating an arrest and transport to the police station. Many of his victims were given drugs and alcoholic beverages before the attack, during which he would perform various tricks, including a handcuff trick. While handcuffed, he would easily free himself using a key hidden between the fingers of one hand and then invite the victim to try the trick themselves. Once the victims were immobilized in one way or another, he would begin to torture them. After the torture, Gacy strangled his victims using a primitive garrote made from rope. John Gacy buried the bodies of his victims in graves about 40 centimeters deep, dug in the crawl space of his house, which contained utility structures and vertical load-bearing elements. The height of the crawl space varied from 60 to 90 centimeters, forcing Gacy to move through it on his hands and knees while digging the graves with his own hands. Those who knew John Wayne Gacy would never have expected him to turn out as he had. Almost everyone who met him described him as a mild-mannered and likable man. For most of his life, he worked in customer service, first managing 3 of his father-in-law's KFC franchises, then starting his own construction business. His customers remembered him as kind, generous, and willing to help people out. He employed local teenagers in need of jobs and contributed heavily to his local junior chamber of commerce. He even took time out of his weekends to dress up as a clown for kids' birthday parties. However, as authorities would learn, something seriously disturbing had been inside him all along. John Wayne Gacy had a close relationship with his mother and 2 sisters, but he struggled with his alcoholic father who physically abused his family. The older Gacy routinely disparaged his son, referring to him as dumb and stupid, and made comparisons between him and his sisters. Gacy's father striking him with a leather belt for inadvertently rearranging parts of an engine he had put together is one of his first memories. When his mother sought to protect him from his abusive father, she was met with claims that he was a mama's boy and a sissy who would probably grow up queer. Gacy still loved his father despite this treatment, but he believed he was never good enough in his father's eyes. In 1949, would occasionally be molested in his truck by a family friend and contractor. These harassment probably served as the main factor for the formation of homosexual tendencies from an early age. Gacy was an underweight, sedentary youngster. He was advised not to participate in school sports due to a cardiac problem. When Gacy was in the 4th grade, he started having blackouts. He was occasionally admitted to the hospital due to these episodes, and in 1957 due to a burst appendix. Gacy later calculated that he had spent nearly a year in the hospital between the ages of 14 and 18, and he blamed this for the fall in his grades. As Gacy lay in a hospital bed, his father publicly accused his son of fabricating the incidents to attract sympathy and attention. Gacy's physical issue was never definitively identified, even though his mother, sisters, and a select group of close friends never questioned his ailment. One of Gacy's high school acquaintances remembers numerous occasions when his father thrashed or made fun of his son without cause. He once saw Gacy's father, who had been drinking, come out of the cellar and start insulting, then strike his son. This happened in 1957. As her kid put up his hands to defend himself, Gacy's mother tried to step in. The acquaintance claimed that Gacy never hit his father in return during these confrontations. Eventually, Gacy probably had enough of the abuse and he picked up and moved out west. While working as a mortuary assistant in Las Vegas, Gacy slept on a cot behind the embalming room. One night, after observing the morticians embalming dead bodies, he crawled into a coffin with one. He laid in the coffin for a time, embracing and caressing the body, a teenage boy. The event shocked him so much that he returned home and enrolled in business school after just a few months in Vegas. He never told anyone about his night with the body in the morgue. After graduating from Northwestern Business College, John Wayne Gacy met Marlynn Myers, a co-worker at a shoe company in Springfield, Illinois. The couple married in 1964, and Gacy took over the management of his father-in-law's Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises in Waterloo, Iowa, where they lived with Myers' parents. He and Myers had 2 children and what was seemingly a perfect life. But in the meantime, Gacy tried to covertly satisfy his depravity. He joined the Waterloo Jaycees, a group of businessmen who participated in wife-swapping, prostitution, pornography, and drug abuse. He even opened a club in his own basement targeted at teenagers, where they could drink and play pool without getting in trouble. He often would build up trust with his victims so they wouldn't need to be on guard, Detective Sergeant Jason Moran of the Cook County Sheriff's Office said years later. He was their employer, their friend. He may have been someone who provided them with alcohol and drugs and maybe a place to sleep at night. That's an easy way to kill someone. Then, Gacy began to force some of these young men, including those he employed at KFC, to perform sexual acts with him. It started in August 1967, when Gacy hired a 15-year-old Donald Voorhees, the son of a fellow member of the Jaycees, to do some housework for him. Gacy lured him into his basement, plied him with alcohol, and committed acts of violence against him. Voorhees kept quiet about the incident until March 1968, when he told his father and spurred a criminal investigation into Gacy that destroyed the facade of a normal life he'd crafted. A few months later, he paid a KFC employee $300 to beat up Voorhees, hoping to scare him from testifying in court. But Voorhees escaped and reported the attempted beating, and the case against Gacy only escalated. In December 1967, John Wayne Gacy pled guilty to sodomy. At that time, sexual relations between 2 people of the same sex was illegal in Iowa. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison and was promptly served divorce papers from his wife, whom he would never see again. But less than 2 years after his sentencing, John Wayne Gacy was granted parole for being a model prisoner. During the short time he was incarcerated, Gacy managed to secure a raise for prison mess hall workers, increased membership of the prison JCs by 600, worked to improve conditions for prisoners, and oversaw the installation of a miniature golf course in the recreation yard. He also pretended he was straight and that he hated gays in order to protect himself from the wrath of his fellow inmates. He was given 12 months probation under the conditions that he move back to Chicago to live with his mother and maintained a 10 p.m. curfew. He agreed and declared, "I'll never go back to jail." Months after his release, when he and his mother were living in Des Plaines, Illinois, John Wayne Gacy lured a teenage boy into his house and tried to rape him. Gacy was charged with sexual assault, but the charges were dropped when the boy failed to show up to court. Gacy had technically violated his parole, but somehow his parole officer was never aware of the episode. By 1971, Gacy had settled into a new home in Norwood Park, a neighborhood in northwestern Chicago. His yellow brick ranch house there, at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, would eventually become a graveyard for 29 young men and boys. It was where all of his gruesome murders would be committed, and also where he would gain local fame as Pogo the Clown. While in prison, John Wayne Gacy had become something of an artist and repeatedly sketched the image of Pogo the Clown. After his release, he joined the local Jolly Joker Club, a clown club that would perform at birthday parties and hospitals. He taught himself how to apply clown makeup and turned himself into Pogo the Clown as he had imagined him in his drawings. He performed as Pogo the Clown at all sorts of local parties, including Democratic Party functions and charitable events. Residents of Norwood Park also remember him showing up to his favorite bar, the Good Luck Lounge, dressed as Pogo the Clown. Would feel much more comfortable if Gacy was this type of creepy, sequestered ghoul that was unkempt and heinous, Moran said. But instead, he dressed as a clown and bounced kids on his knee. He would knock at your door and say, "Vote for my candidate." But Pogo the Clown didn't fool everybody. Carol Hoff, his high school sweetheart and second wife who he married in 1972, questioned his sexuality. When Gacy told her he was bisexual in 1975, Hoff divorced him and left him alone in their house. Though she denied knowledge of what was to come, Hoff later admitted to authorities that she had seen him bringing teenage boys into their garage before. The same year Gacy married Hoff, he committed his first murder, that of Timothy McCoy. He stashed the body under his crawl space. Gacy reportedly managed to kill a second victim while still married to his wife in 1974. That victim is still unidentified, but Gacy claims to have strangled a young man and hidden him in his closet. When the body began to leak, he moved it to the crawl space as well. But after his divorce, the killer clown had the freedom to bring more victims into his home. Save for his final 4 victims, who he dumped into a river, all of John Wayne Gacy's victims were killed in and stored under his house. Gacy's victims were all young men and boys. He preyed on still unidentified teenagers, some who were drifters from out of town, and some who were local boys who worked for him. He lured some into his car by impersonating an officer or to his house with the offer of a job, a place to party, or even money. Once he had his victim in his space, Gacy coaxed them with drugs or alcohol or a sick magic trick, during which he'd handcuff them and dangle the key in front of their face. Then he would torture, rape, and murder them. Gacy would then have the gall to participate in the search parties for some of these boys, as he was friendly with their parents and was considered an upstanding member of the community. He had set himself up to kill unfettered and unsuspected, but his 33rd murder wouldn't go quite as planned. At about 9 p.m. on December 11, 1978, Elizabeth Peast drove to pick up her son, a high school sophomore and honor roll student named Robert, from his job at a pharmacy in Des Plaines. Robert, pissed, went outside and told her to wait a few minutes. He wanted to talk to a customer about a summer contracting job that would pay him twice what he was currently making. That was the last time Elizabeth saw her son. Before midnight, she went to the police station to file a missing persons report. Police figured out that man who Robert Peast was going to talk to was John Wayne Gacy, whose company PDM Contractors had recently remodeled Pist's pharmacy. They called him into the station for questioning, and Gacy obliged, after taking Pist's body and dumping it into the Des Plaines River. Within hours, authorities searched Gacy's home. They didn't find any bodies, but they did find evidence that Peast had been there, a receipt that belonged to a friend of his. Since by the time the trial began, Gacy had given 3 confessions to the police and had told them where to find the bodies of his victims, the question of whether he had committed the killings was not an issue in the case. Instead, the arguments and testimony on both sides focused on the question of Gacy's mental state at the time of the crimes. The prosecution argued that Gacy was an entirely sane and calculating, cold-blooded killer. The defense team tried to convince the jury that Gacy was mentally disturbed, possibly as a result of physical abuse by his father during his childhood, and that he was schizophrenic or suffered from a multiple personality disorder.
John had no value for it all. John didn't value other life. John didn't value other emotions. John didn't value any institutions. John didn't value the feelings of other people.
If the jury could be persuaded that Gacy was mentally disturbed and unable to control his actions, he would be placed in a state mental institution, with the possibility of his being subsequently released if found to be mentally stable. During 13 days of testimony, the prosecution questioned 60 witnesses. They began with the frequently emotional accounts of relatives and friends of some of the victims. Former employees of Gacy testified that they had to frequently rebuff his sexual advances and attempts to persuade them to be handcuffed on the pretext of demonstrating a conjuring trick, a ploy Gacy had apparently used to disable many of the dead victims. Police officers involved in the investigation and forensic experts testified to the circumstances and condition of the bodies recovered and to the cause of death. Most of Gacy's victims were strangled after a loop of rope had been placed around their necks and tightened by turning a length of pipe or a wooden stick inserted into the loop, like a tourniquet. The prosecutors also brought psychologists as expert witnesses who testified that Gacy was sane at the time of the killings. The prosecution rested its case on February 20th, and the defense began the following day. The first witness was Jeff Rignall, a surviving victim of Gacy's attack. It had been expected that Rignall would testify as a prosecution witness, but for tactical reasons the prosecutors chose to rely on their cross-examination. The defense attorneys hoped that Rignall's description of his experiences would help to convince the jurors that Gacy was insane and not in control of his actions at the time that he attacked his victims. Rignall described having been picked up by Gacy in the latter's car and then rendered unconscious with chloroform. When he came to, he was repeatedly raped and sadistically tortured over a period of several hours before being dumped, unconscious, in a Chicago park. Jeff Rignall had been so traumatized by his experience that he became hysterical on the witness stand, began to vomit, and eventually had to be removed from the courtroom. The defense also called Gacy's mother and sister, who described the verbal abuse and beatings he received from his father and his witnessing of the physical abuse of his mother by her husband. Among the 22 witnesses appearing for the defense were 6 psychologists who testified as medical experts that they found Gacy to be mentally impaired by conditions bordering on schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder. They further testified that he was consequently unable to understand the nature of his acts, and therefore should be held to have been insane when he committed the murders. During the later days of the trial, Gacy appeared to become increasingly detached from the proceedings and told the judge on several occasions that he did not understand what was happening. However, on March 7th, Judge Garapo ruled that Gacy was still fit to stand trial. The defense then completed its case the following day, and closing arguments were heard on March 11th. The prosecution reviewed in gruesome detail each of the murders with which Gacy was charged, emphasizing that they were all carefully planned and deliberately carried out. The defense again attempted to convince the jury that a finding of insanity was appropriate. They even suggested that if he was not found insane, a unique opportunity might be missed for studying the mind of the serial killer, from which lessons might be learned which could help prevent the repetition of such crimes. The case went to the jury of 7 men and 5 women on March 12th. They deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. The following day, the same jury was asked to consider the sentence, and after deliberating for 2¼ hours, they sentenced John Wayne Gacy to death. Gacy was sent to the Menard Correctional Center where he remained for the next 14 years. During the long years of the appeals process, Gacy was interviewed by several writers, journalists, and others. The reports from those meetings indicate that he consistently contradicted himself. At times, he would adamantly insist on his innocence and argue that he had been framed. At other times, he would admit guilt for one murder but deny his responsibility for others. Sometimes he would focus on elaborate, supposedly legal arguments as to why his trial had been fundamentally flawed. On other occasions, he seemed to be entirely aware of having carried out all the killings over a 7-year period. No consensus appears to have emerged on the question of whether he actually suffered from a mental disorder or whether his contradictory claims were part of an elaborate and calculated effort to convince others that he did. He looked at his victims like he was taking out the trash. He had no feelings about them, said Gacy's lawyer, Sam Amarante. He could talk about a child who's dying of cancer and cry like a baby about this child he didn't even know or never met, and feel authentically sad about this child. Then he'd talk about another child that he murdered and have no feelings whatsoever. He would spend 14 years in prison awaiting his execution. The night before he was put to death, he returned to his roots and ordered a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken as his last meal. After all his appeals failed, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 19, 1994. In a final statement, he proclaimed his innocence. In 2021, one of John Wayne Gacy's victims, Francis Wayne Alexander, was identified. According to family members, they had hoped for years that Alexander was alive, but for some reason could not contact them. After identifying the victim through DNA analysis, the family expressed gratitude to the police and said they might miss him now.
We have a shot of all of the victims together here. And when you look over at the photos, I have no recollection of any of them. Never met them.
It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. When you depersonalize another person and view them as just an object for pleasure.
Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer who took the lives of 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Over the course of more than 13 years, Dahmer sought out his victims, mostly black men, at gay bars, malls, and bus stops, lured them home with promises of money or sex, and gave them alcohol laced with drugs before strangling them to death. He would then engage in sex acts with the corpses before dismembering them and disposing of them, often keeping body parts as souvenirs. He frequently took photos of his victims at various stages of the murder process, so he could recollect each act afterward and relive the experience. Dahmer was captured in 1991 and sentenced to 16 life terms. He was killed by fellow prison inmate Christopher Scarver in 1994. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee on May 21, 1960, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. He was described as an energetic and happy child until the age of 4, when a traumatic and painful recovery following surgery to correct a double hernia seemed to affect a change in the boy. Noticeably subdued, he became increasingly withdrawn following the birth of his younger brother and the family's frequent moves. By the time Dahmer was of school age, the family had moved to Ohio. From a young age, Dahmer developed a fascination with animal bones and studied how to be clean and preserve them. As a child, he collected large insects and the skulls of small animals, preserved in jars of formaldehyde, according to the Brian Masters book, The Shrine of Jeffrey Dahmer. By his early teens, he was disengaged, tense, and largely friendless. Dahmer claims that his compulsions toward necrophilia and murder began around the age of 14, but it appears that the breakdown of his parents' marriage and their acrimonious divorce a few years later might have been the catalyst for turning these thoughts into actions. Dahmer also started drinking at age 14, and by the time of his first killing at age 18, his alcohol consumption had spun out of control. He dropped out of Ohio State University after 1/4 term, and his recently remarried father insisted that he join the Army. Dahmer enlisted in late December 1978 and was posted to Germany shortly thereafter. His drinking problem persisted, and in early 1981, the Army discharged him. Although German authorities would later investigate possible connections between Dahmer and murders that took place in the area during that time, it is not believed that he took any victims while serving in the armed forces. Following his discharge, Dahmer returned home to Ohio. An arrest later that year for disorderly conduct prompted his father to send Dahmer to live with his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, in Wisconsin, but his alcohol problem continued, and he was arrested the following summer for indecent exposure. He was arrested once again in 1986 when 2 boys accused him of masturbating in front of them. He received a 1-year probationary sentence. Dahmer murdered 17 men between 1978 and 1991. He was careful to select victims on the fringes of society, who were often itinerant or borderline criminal, making their disappearances less noticeable and reducing the likelihood of his capture. He lured them to his home with promises of money or sex, then strangled them to death. He engaged in sex acts with their bodies and kept body parts and photos as souvenirs. His most popular nicknames, the Milwaukee Cannibal and the Milwaukee Monster, reflect his heinous crimes. Dahmer's first murder occurred just after graduating from Revere High School in June 1978, when he picked up an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks and took him home to his parents' house. Dahmer proceeded to get the young man drunk, and when Hicks tried to go, Dahmer said, "I didn't want him to leave." Dahmer killed him by striking him in the head and strangling him with a barbel. Dahmer dismembered Hicks's corpse, packed the body parts in plastic bags, and buried them behind his parents' home. He later exhumed the remains, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered them across a wooded ravine. It wasn't until September 1987 that Dahmer took his second victim, Stephen Tuomi. They checked into a hotel room and drank, and Dahmer eventually awoke to find Tuomi dead, with no memory of the previous night's activities. He later told police he intended to drug Tuomi but not kill him, and he could not believe this had happened. Dahmer bought a large suitcase to transport Tuomi's body to his grandmother's basement, where he dismembered and masturbated on the corpse before disposing of the remains. He kept Tuomi's head, which was wrapped in a blanket, for weeks after the murder. Dahmer later said that after Tuomi's killing, his obsession with killing went into full swing, and he didn't even try to stop it after that. He killed 2 more victims at his grandmother's house before she forced him to move out in 1988. She had no knowledge of his crimes but was tired of his drinking, his tendency to bring young men to her house, and the foul smells occasionally coming from her basement. In September 1989, About a year after moving into his new apartment, Dahmer lured a 13-year-old Laotian boy to his house, claiming he wanted to take nude photos of him. This resulted in charges of sexual exploitation and second-degree sexual assault for Dahmer. He pleaded guilty, claiming that the boy had appeared much older. While awaiting sentencing for his sexual assault case, Dahmer again put his grandmother's basement to gruesome use. In March 1989, he lured, drugged, strangled, sodomized, photographed, dismembered, and disposed of Anthony Sears, an aspiring model. Dahmer found Sears particularly attractive and later said he did not want to lose him, and so Sears became the first victim from whom Dahmer kept preserved body parts for a long period of time, mummifying his head and genitals. At his trial for child molestation in May 1989, Dahmer was the model of contrition, arguing eloquently in his own defense about how he had seen the error of his ways and that his arrest marked a turning point in his life. His defense counsel argued that he needed treatment, not incarceration, and the judge agreed, handing down a 1-year prison sentence on day release, allowing Dahmer to work at his job during the day and return to the prison at night, as well as a 5-year probationary sentence. Years later, in an interview with CNN, Lionel Dahmer stated that he wrote a letter to the court that issued the sentence, requesting psychological help before his son's parole. However, Dahmer was granted an early release by the judge, after serving only 10 months of his sentence. He briefly lived with his grandmother following his release, during which time he does not appear to have added to his body count before moving back into his own apartment. Over the next 2 years, Dahmer would kill 12 more people, bringing his total victim count to 17. His first victim during this time was a prostitute named Raymond Smith, whom Dahmer lured to his apartment for sex, gave a drink laced with sleeping tablets, and then strangled. Dahmer took photos of his body in suggestive positions before dismembering him. With his next victim, Edward Smith, Dahmer accidentally destroyed his skull while trying to dry it in the oven, making it explode. He later told police he felt rotten about Smith's murder because was unable to keep anything from his body, making it feel like a true waste. Dahmer started developing rituals as he progressed with his killings, experimenting with chemical means of disposal and often consuming the flesh of his victims. Dahmer also attempted crude lobotomies. He drilled into the skull of his 11th victim, Errol Lindsay, while he was still alive and injected him with muriatic acid. Dahmer hoped this would place Lindsay into a permanent submissive state, but Lindsay awoke during the procedure and said, "I have a headache. What time is it?" So Dahmer strangled him. On May 27, 1991, Dahmer's neighbor Sandra Smith called the police to report that an Asian boy was running naked in the street. When the police arrived, the boy was incoherent, and they accepted the word of Dahmer, a white man in a largely poor black community, that the boy was his 19-year-old lover. In fact, the boy was 14 years old and was, unbeknownst to Dahmer, the younger brother of the Laotian teen Dahmer had molested 3 years earlier. The police escorted Dahmer and the boy home. Clearly not wishing to become embroiled in a homosexual domestic disturbance, they took only a cursory look around before leaving. According to Dahmer, an officer peeked his head around in the bedroom but didn't really take a good look, and then left after telling Dahmer to take care of the boy. Once they left the scene, Dahmer injected hydrochloric acid into the boy's brain, killing him. Had the police conducted even a basic search, they would have found the body of Dahmer's 12th victim, Tony Hughes. Dahmer killed 4 more men before he was finally arrested. One of his last victims was Oliver Lacey, 24, whose body Dahmer had sex with before dismembering the corpse. He kept Lacey's head and heart in his refrigerator and his skeleton in a freezer. Dahmer's killing spree ended when he was arrested on July 22, 1991. The body parts found in Dahmer's refrigerator and Polaroid photographs of his victims became inextricably associated with his notorious killing spree. 2 Milwaukee police officers were led to Dahmer when they picked up Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old black man who was wandering the streets with handcuffs dangling from his wrist. They decided to investigate the man's claims that a weird dude had drugged and restrained him. They arrived at Dahmer's apartment, where he calmly offered to get the keys for the handcuffs. Edwards claimed that the knife Dahmer had threatened him with was in the bedroom. When the officer went in to corroborate the story, he noticed Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies lying around. Dahmer was subdued by the officers, after which he muttered the words, "For what I did, I should be dead." Subsequent searches revealed a head in the refrigerator, 3 more in the freezer, and a catalog of other horrors, including preserved skulls, jars containing genitalia, and an extensive gallery of macabre Polaroid photographs of his victims. Dahmer later said he had planned to build a private altar from his victims' skulls, adorned with incense sticks and globe lights. He hoped the altar would be a place where I could feel at home. Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. Given that the majority of Dahmer's victims were black, there were considerable racial tensions, so strict security precautions were taken, including an 8-foot barrier of bulletproof glass that separated him from the gallery. The inclusion of only 1 black person on the jury provoked further unrest, but was ultimately contained and short-lived. Dahmer initially pleaded not guilty to all charges, despite having confessed to the killings during police interrogation. He eventually changed his plea to guilty by virtue of insanity. His defense then offered the gruesome details of his behavior as proof that only someone insane could commit such terrible acts. The jury chose to believe the prosecution's assertion that Dahmer was fully aware that his acts were evil and chose to commit them anyway. On February 15, 1992, they returned after approximately 10 hours deliberation to find him guilty, but sane, on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, with a 16th term tacked on in May. Dahmer reportedly adjusted well to prison life at the Columbia Correctional Institution in south-central Wisconsin, though he was initially kept apart from the general population. He eventually convinced authorities to allow him to integrate more fully with other inmates. He found religion in the form of books and photos sent to him by his father, and he was granted permission by the Columbia Correctional Institution to be baptized by a local pastor. Dahmer was killed on November 28, 1994, by his fellow prison inmate Christopher Scarver. In accordance with his inclusion in regular work details, Dahmer was assigned to work with 2 other convicted murderers, Scarver and Jesse Anderson. After they had been left alone to complete their tasks, guards returned to find that Scarver had brutally beaten both men with a metal bar from the prison weight room. Dahmer was pronounced dead after approximately 1 hour. Anderson died from his injuries days later. In 2015, Scarver spoke to the New York Post about his reasons for killing Dahmer. Scarver alleged that he was disturbed not only by Dahmer's crimes, but by a habit Dahmer had developed of fashioning severed limbs from prison food to antagonize other inmates. After being taunted by Dahmer and Anderson during their work detail, Scarver said that he confronted Dahmer about his crimes before beating the 2 men to death. He also claimed that prison guards allowed the murders to happen by leaving them alone. When Mary Ann Nichols stumbled into the night on August 30, 1888, she was filled with a hazy confidence. She lacked the money to pay for a bed at her lodging house, but she was wearing a new bonnet and was certain that she could make enough money through sex work. Just hours later, she was found brutally murdered, her bonnet at her side. No one knew it then, but Nichols was the first canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. At first, Nichols appeared to be just another murder victim in London's Whitechapel district, which was known for its violence. Whitechapel was overflowing with brothels and low-cost lodging houses, and it wasn't uncommon for women like her to die violent deaths. Still, Nichols's murder struck police as being especially brutal, as her throat had been cut and she had been disemboweled. Then, other women started turning up dead and mutilated in eerily similar ways. The police had a serial killer on their hands. For several terrifying weeks between August and November 1888, Jack the Ripper stalked through Whitechapel. He eventually murdered 4 more canonical victims: Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, before the bloody killings seemed to abruptly stop. Police were left with few clues: a piece of cloth, letters that may or may not have been from the killer, and of course, the crime scenes themselves, which hinted at rage toward women and sex workers in particular. So who was Jack the Ripper? His identity remains debated to this day, and thus the weeks that he terrorized London cast an oversized shadow across history. Could the killer have been a mentally ill hairdresser, a murderous midwife, or even a member of the British monarchy? By the time Mary Ann Nichols was murdered in August 1888, a number of violent crimes had rattled police and locals in Whitechapel. In April, a sex worker named Emma Elizabeth Smith had been so brutally attacked by a group of men that she died of her injuries. Then, in August, a sex worker named Martha Tabram had been fatally stabbed almost 40 times. These brutal events appeared to be of little concern to Nichols, a 43-year-old divorced alcoholic who turned to sex work to scrape by. Nichols bounced from lodging house to lodging house, and one of her roommates remembered her as being very clean, but melancholy. By August 1888, Nichols was living at a lodging house at 56 Flower and Dean Street in Whitechapel. On the night of August 30th, she squandered the few shillings she had at the Frying Pan public house, and was turned away at her lodging house on August 31st when she tried to return around 1:20 a.m. "Never mind," Nichols told the night watchman. Pointing to her hat, she added, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." Nichols set off, presumably hoping to earn enough money through sex work to afford a bed. At around 2:30 a.m., she crossed paths with Emily Holland, a former roommate who tried to convince her to call it a night. "I've had my DOS money 3 times today and spent it," Nichols exclaimed. She reassured Holland, "It won't be long before I'm back." But Emily Holland was the last person to see Nichols alive. About an hour later, Mary Ann Nichols was found brutally murdered on Bucks Row. At around 3:40 a.m., a man named Charles Cross noticed a dark bundle on the ground as he made his way to work along Bucks Row. As he approached, Cross realized it was the body of a woman. He and another man passing by, Robert Paul, examined the body. Cross thought the woman was dead. Paul thought that she was still breathing. Shortly after they set off to alert authorities, Police Constable John Neal came upon the scene. Neal later said, "I examined the body by the aid of my lamp and noticed blood oozing from a wound in the throat. She was lying on her back with her clothes disarranged. I felt her arm, which was quite warm from the joints upwards. Her eyes were wide open. Her bonnet was off and lying at her side." An autopsy subsequently found that Mary Ann Nichols had died a shockingly violent death. Her throat had been cut, her abdomen had been sliced open, and her killer had even stabbed her in the vagina. "I have seen many terrible cases," Dr. Reese Ralph Llewellyn, who examined the body, told the Times, "but never such a brutal affair as this." But other brutal murders soon would follow. Jack the Ripper's next canonical victim, Annie Chapman, was killed just days later. In the week that followed Mary Ann Nichols' murder, police began speaking to local sex workers. They learned about a man known as Leather Apron, who had a reputation for threats and violence against sex workers. Before long, newspapers in Whitechapel started to report about the suspect. His expression is sinister and seems to be full of terror for the women who describe it, the Star ominously reported on September 5, 1888. His eyes are small and glittering. His lips are usually parted in a grin which is not only not reassuring but excessively repellent. By September 7th, police had quietly identified the mysterious Leather Apron as Jonh Pietzar, a Polish Jew who worked as a boot finisher. At present, a police report noted, there is no evidence whatsoever against him. But then, on September 8th, another woman turned up murdered. Her name was Annie Chapman. Like Mary Ann Nichols, Chapman had a drinking problem and was separated from her husband, who eventually died, ending his financial support. And like Nichols, Chapman had turned to sex work so she could afford to live at local lodging houses. Just before her death, she was residing at a lodging house called Crossingham's, which was located at 35 Dorset Street. In another eerie parallel, Chapman, like Nichols, didn't have enough money to stay at her lodging house on the night of her death. When she returned to Crossingham's around 1:30 a.m., Chapman admitted to the house's night watchman that she couldn't pay for a bed yet. "I'll soon be back," Chapman said. Then she vanished into the night. At around 5:30 a.m., a woman named Elizabeth Long saw Chapman with a man standing against a wall at number 29 on Hanbury Street. Long later described the man as a foreigner who was wearing a deerstalker hat. She heard the man say, "Will you?" and Chapman reply, "Yes." Long then hurried on. About 30 minutes later, a resident of number 29 Hanbury Street came across Annie Chapman's body on the ground near the building. Her face and hands were covered in blood and her skirt was pulled up. Her murder was even more brutal than Nichols had been. An inquest found that Chapman's body was terribly mutilated. Her killer had cut her throat, disemboweled her, and pulled her intestines out of her body and placed them over her right shoulder. The murderer had also removed her uterus and parts of her bladder and vagina. What's more, a leather apron had been found at the scene. The next day, police arrested Leather Apron himself, Jonh Pietzar. But investigators could find nothing to tie Pietzar to the crime. His family members wholeheartedly vouched for him. There was no blood in his house or on the knives he used for boot finishing, and Pietzar was able to provide solid alibis for the times of the murders of both Nichols and Chapman. Police had no choice but to let him go, and thus the search for Nichols and Chapman's killer continued. Not only were local police on the case, but concerned Whitechapel residents had gotten involved too. On September 10th, a local named George Lusk formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee to keep an eye out for the so-called Whitechapel murderer. Soon, however, the killer would be known by a different name. On September 27, 1888, the Central News Agency received a letter addressed to the boss. The so-called Dear Boss letter appeared to be from the Whitechapel murderer himself, who gleefully mocked the police. "That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits," the author wrote. "I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. My knife's so nice and sharp I want to get to work right away if I get a chance." Then he wrote himself into history by signing his name, Jack the Ripper. Whether or not the Dear Boss letter was authentic, the killer would forever be known as Jack the Ripper, and he would soon strike again. On September 30th, 1888, the killer took his third victim, Elizabeth Stride. Though she'd been born in Sweden as Elizabeth Gustafsdotter, Stride was cut from the same cloth as Nichols and Chapman. Separated from her husband, who died of tuberculosis in 1884, Stride was an alcoholic who made a living as a sex worker. At the time of her death, she was residing at a lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street in Whitechapel. Unlike Nichols and Chapman, however, who were forced out into the night due to a lack of funds, Stride apparently went out on her own volition. Having made a small sum of money from cleaning rooms at the lodging house, she put on a nice dress and left her residence in the evening. That night, A number of people claim to have seen Stride in the company of a short, respectable-looking man with dark hair and a mustache. At one point, Stride and the man were seen hugging and kissing by a pub. Then, around 12:45 a.m., a man named Israel Schwartz saw an alarming sight. He claimed a short man with dark hair and a mustache grabbed Stride and threw her onto the ground. A second man nearby lit his pipe, and then the first man shouted an anti-Semitic insult. Frightened, Schwartz fled. Stride's body was found 15 minutes later. Her throat had been cut so deeply that she was nearly decapitated, but the rest of Elizabeth Stride's body was not nearly as mutilated as Mary Ann Nichols or Annie Chapman's had been. This led investigators to believe that Jack the Ripper had been interrupted during his murder of Stride, which is perhaps why the infamous killer struck again just 45 minutes later. Elizabeth Stride spent her last hours alive in the company of a mysterious mustached stranger. Jack the Ripper's fourth canonical victim, Catherine Eddowes, spent hers detained in a police station. Though poor and a heavy drinker, Eddowes was different in some ways from Nichols, Chapman, and Stride. Her friends and family adamantly claimed that she was not a sex worker, despite sources that said otherwise. And Eddowes was in a happy relationship with a man named John Kelly. Eddowes and Kelly had spent the days leading up to Eddowes' death trying to make money. Eventually, Eddowes said that she would ask her daughter for a loan. As the couple parted ways for what was supposed to be a brief time, Kelly allegedly told her to watch out for the Whitechapel murderer. Eddowes purportedly waved off his concerns and responded, "Don't you fear for me. I'll take care of myself and I shan't fall into his hands." That was the last time that Kelly ever saw her. It's unclear exactly how Eddowes spent her last day alive, September 29, 1888. But by 8:30 p.m., she was so drunk that the police hauled her to the Bishopsgate police station to sleep it off. Eddowes rested, started singing to herself, and then promised the guard on duty that she could take care of herself. So, at around 1 a.m. on September 30th, 1888, he let her go. This was around the same time that police were discovering Stride's body. About 30 minutes later, a group of men spotted Eddowes talking with a man near Duke Street. One of them recalled that the man was fair-skinned and that he wore a red handkerchief around his throat, but the witness didn't stop to look closer. He hurried on, and just 15 minutes later, Eddowes was found brutally murdered in Mitre Square. Jack the Ripper had killed Eddowes in an especially brutal fashion. Her throat was cut 6 or 7 inches across. She'd been disemboweled, and her cheeks, eyelids, and nose were mutilated. Eddowes' attacker had also taken her left kidney, sliced up her uterus, and removed most of her womb. But he'd also left behind some evidence. Police investigating the scene found a piece of Eddowes' apron covered in blood and fecal matter in an alleyway near Goulston Street, which was about 15 minutes away from Mitre Square. This suggested that the killer had headed back into Whitechapel after murdering Eddowes. It seemed that Jack the Ripper was escalating at an alarming pace, but it would be more than a month before the Whitechapel murderer killed again. After the bloody double event, the murders of Stride and Eddowes, Jack the Ripper went quiet for a while. It wasn't until October 16th that he resurfaced by purportedly sending a letter to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. The letter included a piece of a kidney and read, "From hell, Mr. Lusk. Sor, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman preserved it for you to their piece I fried and ate it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." The kidney seemed to show signs of Bright's disease. Eddowes was believed to have suffered from this condition, and the press thus speculated that the kidney included in the so-called "from hell" letter once belonged to her. Still, an uneasy quiet settled in Whitechapel as October bled into November. Then, on November 9, 1888, Jack the Ripper took his fifth and final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, and her murder was the most horrific of them all. Kelly, though younger than the other Jack the Ripper victims, had trod some of the same paths as them. After making her way to London from Ireland in the 1880s, she dabbled in sex work to make ends meet. But Kelly did not live in a lodging house at the time of her death. She lived in a room at 13 Miller's Court on Dorset Street, which she'd shared with her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Joseph Barnett. Barnett had moved out after an argument, which meant that Kelly spent many nights there alone. On November 9th, around 2 a.m., a man who knew Kelly named George Hutchinson saw her strike up a conversation with a man on the corner of Commercial and Thrall. The two exchanged a laugh, and then Hutchinson heard the man say, "You will be all right for what I have told you." Hutchinson watched as Kelly led the man toward Miller's Court. He hung around for a while and then left. Around 4 a.m., two witnesses were awoken by someone crying, "Oh, murder!" Later that morning, Kelly's landlord's assistant went to collect rent. The assistant knocked on the door, and when no one answered, he peered in the window. At first, he saw what looked like slabs of meat on the bedside table. Then, he saw Kelly's mutilated corpse. In the privacy of 13 Miller's Court, Jack the Ripper had committed his most brutal murder yet. Police found Kelly's mangled body lying on her blood-soaked bed. As the postmortem report stated, the whole of the surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of the features. Her murder showed just how hellish Jack the Ripper could be. But after Kelly's death, the infamous serial killer seemed to stop killing. Though other women were murdered in Whitechapel in the months and years that followed, none of these crimes were tied definitively to Jack the Ripper. Over 100 years after Jack the Ripper terrorized the neighborhood of Whitechapel, the serial killer's identity remains a chilling mystery. But there are plenty of theories, some more sound than others. Two of the most intriguing Jack the Ripper suspects to emerge throughout the years are Aaron Kosminski and James Maybrick. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who worked as a barber in Whitechapel, was actually named as a suspect during the original Jack the Ripper investigation. One investigator noted that he had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. What's more, some claim that DNA evidence from a shawl that belonged to Catherine Eddowes definitively links Kosminski to Eddowes' murder. However, many serious questions about this DNA evidence remain. The shawl was likely handled by multiple people. Eddowes could have had the DNA of multiple people on her shawl, and it's not even confirmed that the shawl was found at any of the Jack the Ripper crime scenes. As for James Maybrick, his name appeared as a potential suspect much later. In the 1990s, a diary allegedly kept by him emerged, which seemed to contain details of the 5 canonical murders that only the killer would know. And the diary ends with, "I give my name that all know of me, so history do tell what love can do to a gentleman born. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Around the same time, a 19th century watch also surfaced. It's inscribed with J. Maybrick, "I am Jack," and the initials of the 5 canonical victims. But controversy surrounds these items, as some believe the diary isn't authentic, especially since the man who found it kept changing his story about how he located it. And tests on the watch were not fully conclusive. Indeed, some people believe that Jack the Ripper was not Kosminski or Maybrick, but someone else entirely. Then again, some theories claim that we've gotten Jack the Ripper wrong all these years. One suggests that he was not targeting sex workers, but instead people who were sleeping on the ground. Victims like Nichols and Chapman certainly had nowhere else to sleep, and this theory could explain why witnesses never heard much screaming around the times of the murders. Another theory suggests that Jack the Ripper was looking to stoke anti-Semitism in Whitechapel. The area's Jewish population had been growing in the 1880s, leading to increased tensions over unemployment, housing shortages, and immigration. This theory postulates that the killer murdered his victims to inflame anti-Jewish sentiment. After all, the leather apron suspect was Jewish, and graffiti found by Eddowes's bloody apron referenced Jews. This all could have been a coincidence, but perhaps not. But at the end of the day, these are all just theories, though we can study every detail of the Jack the Ripper story, from the lives of his victims, to the streets where they were killed, to the reaction of the police. One crucial part is still missing. Jack the Ripper's true face remains lost to time.